2018 to order. Can I get a roll call for members, please?
Dirk Bowden,
Here.
Ellen Bucknam,
Present.
Emery Dorsey,
Here.
Janet Leo, here. Scott Ohm,
Here.
Vivian Voss,
Here.
Amanda Weaver.
The next order on the agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Is there a motion to approve the order of the agenda?
I move to approve the order of the agenda.
Is there a second?
Second.
Is there any additions or corrections to the agenda? Call for a vote.
Motion carried 7-0.
Is there a motion to approve the order of minutes for March 1st, 2018?
I make a motion to approve the minutes for March 1st.
Second.
Are there any additions or corrections to the minutes? Call for a vote.
Motion carried 5-0 with 2 abstaining.
We'll now move to the public forum. This is the time for any person to speak on any subject not appearing on tonight's agenda. Is there anybody signed up for that?
There's none.
There's none. We will close the public forum. I would like to, before we move into the case, I'd just like to make a quick statement. I'd like to welcome the members of the public and ask that you respect the statements made by city staff, the applicant, and my fellow planning commissioner during the proceedings. It is important that the public meeting be conducted in a dignified and respectful manner. Please do not clap, yell, boo, make commentary from the audience, or otherwise disrupt the proceedings. Thank you. I now open up the public hearing for case number WZ-17-11, an application filed by Shaw Investments for approval of a zone change from Agriculture 1 to Planned Residential Development with an outline development plan for property located at 5372 to 5392 Quail Street. The outline development plan proposes a mix of single-family homes and townhomes, and I ask for the staff report.
Alrighty. Excuse me. Good evening. For the record, Zach Wallace-Mendez, planner with the Community Development Department. As you stated, I will be presenting case number WZ-1711, request for approval of a zone change from Agricultural 1 to Planned Residential Development on just over 5 acres of land located at 5372 and 5392 Quail Street. I would like to enter into the public record the contents of the case file, the zoning ordinance, the comprehensive plan, and this digital presentation. The property is located within the city of Wheat Ridge, and all appropriate notification and posting requirements have been met. Therefore, the Planning Commission does have jurisdiction to hear the case.
So noted.
Alrighty, we are looking at a 2016 aerial of the subject property outlined in red. It is located on Quail Street, just south of 54th Avenue. Quail Street currently only connects down south to Ridge Road. You can see there's a black kind of dashed line that goes around the property. That is the city boundary line, so everything to the east, west, and north of the property are within the city of Arvada. To the north and the east is the Skyline Estates subdivision. To the south are some agricultural properties, and then further south, which does not show up on this aerial, are some public improvements made in the Quail Ridge Estate subdivision, which is currently under construction. This is an overlay of that same 2016 aerial with the zoning overlaid. So of course we don't have Arvada zoning, so it's hatched out. But within the city of Wheat Ridge, this property and the properties to the south are zoned A1, so agricultural uses. And then further to the south, you can see the color changes a bit. Down here, this is where the Quail Ridge Estates is. And then you can see further to the east, Skyline Estates is actually in both Arvada and Wheat Ridge. So immediately adjacent to the site, it's in Arvada, but then if you go further down the road, it's back in Wheat Ridge again. There's kind of a crazy border with Arvada in this area of town. And you may notice down at the corner, there's a little piece of planned industrial development. That was actually part of Skyline Estates. I just wanted to point it out because you don't see typically industrial zoning this close to residential. It's actually for the Arvada Fire Protection District Station. So that's where they're located, and that it's zoned planned industrial development. So as we just noted, the current zoning on the property is Agricultural 1, a zone district that allows for agricultural and agriculturally related uses like farmers markets and things like that. It also allows for single-family homes on a minimum of 1 acre of land. The proposed planned residential development would allow for single-family attached and detached homes. The attached units are proposed to be centrally located on the property, with the detached units kind of bordering around the edge to provide a buffer from those existing single-family homes that you just saw in the existing aerial. The zone changes being requested are accompanied by an outline development plan. So an outline development plan establishes the zoning, overall development concepts, permitted uses, and development parameters for the site. It also provides a general layout of building locations and circulation concepts. On the screen is the first of 2 pages for the proposed Quail Run outline development plan, which is the project for this property. I acknowledge that it's too small for anyone to read. I just wanted to provide a quick overview of the documents that make up the ODP. Full-size copies are available in the packets, and the packets are available online for anyone who wants to access those. So on the first page, sorry, I almost jumped forward too quickly. The first page establishes the project location by a map and also a legal description. We also have various signature blocks for the owners. If this project is approved, there's city notification blocks. It would have to be recorded at the county, so there's a county notary block, just kind of all the general stuff, as well as a list of allowed uses and a character of development statement, so kind of generally describing what this project is and what it seeks to construct. The second page establishes the general lot layout. This is in no ways a subdivision at all, but just generally how the developer believes they will lay out the property. So they defined it in 2 use areas. So along the northern and eastern boundary of the property is the use area for the single-family detached homes, so typical single-family homes. And then this use area in the middle here is for the single-family attached homes, so townhomes. These outer single-family homes will front the public streets, both their garages and their front doors. In the townhomes, townhome area, they will be alley-loaded garages, so kind of tucked away in the back with front doors facing the public right-of-way or the open space, sorry. So quickly, I'll describe those use areas. I jumped a little bit ahead of myself. So for the first use area, outlined here in red, of course, single-family homes, a maximum of 14 units. Architectural standards are pretty typical with our planned residential developments in town. We don't have any standards for single-family homes under straight zone districts. This is typically what we see in single-family developments around town that are developed under the planned residential zoning is a 30% masonry requirement. What the developer has asked in this case is to be able to aggregate that across the lots, and in that way they can achieve kind of maximum variation between homes, some of which the architectural style may require almost no masonry, and some of which may require all masonry. So that provides a little bit more flexibility and should add a little bit to the streetscape instead of just having kind of like a 4-foot band of stone kind of throughout the whole neighborhood. Maximum building height is consistent with the current zoning as well as all of our residential zone districts, 35 feet. The building orientation, as I mentioned before, front doors and garages facing the public right-of-way. Lot coverage is proposed to be a maximum of 60%, and setbacks, they proposed a 10-foot minimum for the front, 5-foot minimum for the sides, and a 15-foot minimum for the rear. I will note the current outline development plan that is in your packet notes the rear setback to be 10 feet. We're adding a condition of approval that be increased to 15 feet to kind of increase the buffer, or increase the backyard space and buffer between these homes and the single-family homes that are existing in the neighborhood to the east and the north. For the single-family attached or townhomes, there is a maximum of 42 units, and we've written into the development standards that those can be split up in a couple different ways, just to provide some flexibility and not kind of back a developer into a box of having to provide, very specific number of units and a very specific number of buildings. So we've allowed a range. I don't have them written in front of me, but I believe it was 3 to 6 units between 8 to 12 buildings. So I think what they've shown here is 10 buildings, and so that can fluctuate a bit. But generally, what you're seeing on this concept plan in those hashed marks is generally where buildings will be located. The architecture defers back to our architectural and site design manual for multifamily development. So that has quite a number of requirements, including articulation along the front or along the facades, any facade facing a public right-of-way or open space. It also requires certain materials, certain percentage of materials. So it's pretty robust, and staff feels comfortable with them relying on that for their architectural standards for this part of the development. Again, maximum height is 35 feet, consistent with all of our residential zone districts. Building orientation, as I mentioned before. The minimum open space required in this area is a minimum of 30%. And then for the setbacks, since this is a little unique layout here, what we've done is we've grouped it a little bit differently. Front and sides facing the street or alley have a 10-foot setback. Front or sides facing the open space have a 5-foot setback. And then the rear-facing sides of the home can be 0 feet along the alleys. So essentially where the garages are can be right on the property line in the alley. So the zone change process includes a neighborhood meeting that was held on December 5th, 2017. There were approximately 22 neighbors in attendance, at least from the sign-in sheet. There was also, actually, sorry, I was jumping ahead and just reading off the slides and not my notes, sorry. I should note, staff received 2 comment letters prior to the neighborhood meeting and 1 after. All of those have been included in your packet, and a lot of the concerns were about density. In the original proposal that was presented at the neighborhood meeting, there were townhomes on 54th Avenue, and there was some concern about that. So those have been internalized, and it's all single-family homes now along 54th Avenue. And there were also general questions about traffic impacts, architecture, drainage, potential price points, all that kind of stuff. There is a public posting and notification requirement for all public hearings. So during the public notification for this public hearing, we received 1 call inquiring about property lines, surveys, and just the general process timeline. If this were approved, what is the next step, that kind of stuff. And for the referral with our outside agencies, there were no major concerns. We will obviously continue to work with our outside agencies, water, sanitation, fire, if this progresses forward to make sure that they are adequately able to serve the property. So similar to what the resident who called me asked about, the next steps in the process if this ODP are approved. So if this ODP is approved, the next things that we would see probably concurrently would be the subdivision plat and the specific development plan. The subdivision plat would plat property lines, so once this is developed, they could be sold, individual lots. And the specific development plan, that establishes the exact site layout that we'll be looking at, exact building elevations, final drainage reports, all those kind of final concrete details that we will be holding them to with their building permits. With the subdivision plat, we also always do a subdivision improvement agreement between the city and the developer. And that establishes when public infrastructure is constructed in relation to building permits. So typically how that works is we require all public infrastructure to be in place prior to a building permit being issued. So that way, we know that there's adequate access and utilities feeding the site prior to development. As the commissioners are aware, one criteria for a zone change is consistency with the comprehensive plan. The subject property is noted here by the arrow up here. In the yellow stands for neighborhoods. The neighborhoods is a broad category that generally has the goals of maintaining and enhancing the quality and character of Wheat Ridge's established neighborhoods, increasing housing options, and increasing investment and stability in the city. Staff's analysis of the comprehensive plan does find that this proposal is in compliance with the neighborhood designation. So there's a lot of words on the screen here, but this is the criteria that we use to evaluate all outline development plan requests. So generally that they promote the health, safety, and general welfare, that the development, because this is a plan development, is not feasible under any of the straight zone districts that we have in the city, so like R1, R2, R3. Adequate infrastructure are available to serve the site, and the change in zone is in conformance with the comprehensive plan. So again, a lot of words, but staff does conclude that the proposed zone change does promote the health, safety, and welfare. It is consistent with the comprehensive plan. It includes a circulation network that supports the city's goals related to bicycle and pedestrian connectivity. So this would connect Quayle Street up to 54th Avenue. And this does establish enhanced design controls relative to site design and architecture that will result in a high quality development. So for those reasons, staff does recommend approval of the zone change with 3 conditions. And those 3 conditions are listed here, and they're also listed in your staff report. The paper that I handed out earlier is a revised recommended motions page. We found 2 typos today as we were going through things, one final sweep. So that does have just 2 minor tweaks, 1 sentence that was cut off, and then I think 1 other typo. But all 3 conditions are on both of those sheets. One is that the specific development plan and subdivision plat shall not be reviewed at any public hearing until Quayle Street has been dedicated as right-of-way. Quayle Street is the main point of access for this development, so we will not be entertaining any public hearings until that is dedicated and we know a construction timeline. If final utility and or drainage designs affect off-site property owners, written authorization shall be provided prior to public hearings. Based on our initial conversations with the applicant, it is likely that some drainage may impact some neighbors, not impact as in flood their properties, but just they may need access to people's properties or things like that. So we'll need written authorization from those property owners, as well as the city of Arvada, since it will be taking place in the city of Arvada, that everyone signs off on the final drainage plan that's in place. And finally, as I mentioned before, we would request that the single-family detached minimum rear yard setback be revised to 15 feet instead of 10. So that is the end of my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I feel like I actually fumbled through that a bit, so please ask me any questions that I may have skipped over. The applicant is also here and has a presentation ready if the commission would like to hear that as well.
Thank you. Mr. Bone?
Yeah, with regards to the development standards, specifically for the single-family attached homes, there is a 30% minimum open space requirement. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. Just looking at the ODP, that second page, just from the eye test, it doesn't seem like those 2 open space designations would add up to 30%. I don't know if I'm...
Sure, so that's the dedicated open space area. Open space also applies to kind of what would be the front yard areas and the side yard areas that front, the public rights of way and
Gotcha, okay.
space kind of in between the building footprint and the open space.
Okay. And was there a trip generation report submitted with the ODP? Is that required? Okay, I thought in the neighborhood meeting notes.
There was, there was a trip generation letter, and we have a peak hour trip in the PM of 37 trips. So that's typically not high enough to trigger our full-on traffic impact study. When you hit 60 trips, that's when it triggers a more detailed traffic impact analysis.
Okay. That's it for now.
Commissioner Moaknam?
Okay, just just to piggyback on what Commissioner Bowden was saying, so the public right-of-way, the paved public right-of-way is counted as open space?
No, not the public right-of-way.
All right, that's,
So the open space area is against the public right-of-way, so
okay. So we're talking like
Back of sidewalk?
sidewalk and.
right. So what it would essentially be like side yards and front yards for those attached homes would be counted towards open space.
So it doesn't necessarily, we're not, when we talk about 30% open space requirement, it's not publicly accessible open space, it's just open space in general?
Right.
Okay,
And they have provided publicly accessible open space with this as well.
all right. And just so I'm sure I understand, I looked at some of this, let's see, where is it? The site photos, Exhibit 8, on page 24. That top photo, the view of 54th Avenue looking east with the existing Skyline Estates, single-family homes on the left side, which is the north side. And we've got 54th, and there looks like it's a public drive for access to those homes in a tree median, and then 54th Avenue itself is to the right there, correct?
Correct, yep.
And the subject property is behind that fenced area to the far right of the photo.
Correct.
So it's my understanding with the ODP talking about having the garages and front doors facing the interior, what we'd be looking at here, if you were driving east on 54th Avenue on the right side, you'd basically be seeing the backs of single-family homes,
Correct.
backyards, some sort of fence that's universal or consistent for the whole property.
Yeah, we haven't, well,
That's more of an SDP
sure, yep, exactly.
issue. Okay. All right. Just trying to get the orientation figured out in my head. So that's helpful. Thank you.
Commissioner Dorsey?
I was curious on the timeline for the development of Quail Street, in as much as Arvada is involved in that also, and we're sort of dead end up here on 54th.
Sure, so, you mean this development to the west?
Right. Right, and then, but you got Quail Street needs to be finished or put in.
Right, yep, so, yes.
And you've got Arvada on the one side that's going to be involved in that,
Correct,
and they haven't done anything with this empty space to the west. So, I mean, and they're planning to do something, but
correct.
from what I read,
Yep, so the city of Arvada currently has a land use application in for rezoning on this, it's much larger than what you can see here.
Right.
For, I think it's approximately like 500 dwelling units, something like that, multiple housing types. I believe the plan, the last we saw it, had 54th connecting down into the property. And then, you know, we've had meetings with the city of Arvada, as well as the developer for this property and the developer for the property to the west, to talk through some of these issues. So everyone is aware that Quail Street, the Quail Street shift into the city of Arvada further south down here is actually the Arvada developers. That was their plan. And then they plan to continue it just straight up where they shifted over into the city of Arvada. And they are aware that if this property develops first, they will, this property will either need to wait for them to develop and build Quail Street, or they will need to dedicate Quail Street to the city of Arvada and then have it built to the city of Arvada's specifications with, I believe it's the sidewalk to our specifications. It gets a little tricky here. But they are fully aware that of all of these kind of if-then kind of scenarios. And that's why one of our conditions of approval is that we don't move forward with anything to a public hearing unless we know the certainty of Quail Street. Because if they're unable to get that dedicated, then we're not going to entitle the rest of this property,
Okay,
or further entitle this property.
so this could be a way out?
Potentially,
much as-
yes, unless
Right.
the developer is able to work in agreement with the developer to the west, with dedicating right-of-way outside of their public hearing process for the overall development to the west.
Thank you. That's it.
Commissioner Voss?
I had a couple questions. Just why are these 3 fingers of property still in Wheat Ridge as opposed to being annexed by Arvada?
I have no idea. Well, I have no idea actually why they haven't been annexed by the city of Arvada.
Or why would we want to keep them?
I don't know.
Yeah.
The border's been that way. I've tried researching how it ended up with that, maybe some sort of odd land deal. I have no idea how it ended up like that, but that's just how it is and how we deal with it now.
Okay. On page 6, there was a reference to code enforcement being an issue on, I assume, this property, thus let's build something and we could do away with the code enforcement. Can you tell us what has been the issue with code enforcement there?
Sure. So I only know anecdotally code enforcement issues on several of these properties in the area. I don't know if Lauren might be able to speak more to those. In specific, I mean, you want to know kind of specific.
Well, what kind?
Okay.
You know, not specific to, but
Yeah, so our access to the code enforcement files are pretty high level because that we don't have the official police reports, but it's my understanding that several years ago, the folks that were living on the property, as you can kind of see from the aerial, it was sort of a junk weeds type situation, so nothing incredibly criminal, but they were cooperative with our code enforcement division over a period of years to try to clean up the properties. As you can imagine, when you have a large site that's zoned agriculturally, that's sort of tucked back, not visible, things accumulate, and I think that's kind of what happened here. So not a major issue, but just something that's a part of the history.
right, it was actually used as one of the reasons why, so I just wondered if it was that
Sure.
high of a reason. And then are there any grocery schools, industrial, or groceries or schools or industrial in this kind of immediate area? How far away is all of that from this housing?
The nearest grocery store, I can tell you, there's a school further down on 52nd. When I was in the neighborhood, there were a bunch of kids walking to school, so I believe there's one maybe further up on Parfait, a little ways. And then you asked about industrial.
Industrial, yeah.
I know, so right off the screen here, just south of this 53rd is Ridge Road. South of Ridge Road a bit, I don't think it's on either of these aerials, no. South of Ridge Road, there are some industrial uses. So I think the bottling plant is in this general vicinity, maybe closer to Miller. I know there are some Excel towers in the area. Those aren't really industrial, but just those kinds of things. No heavy industrial, I guess, at least in my view.
The closest grocery stores are probably towards Kipling, so you can see sort of the alphabetized streets. Kipling's going to be just off the screen to the right. A little bit south towards the interstate is Super Target, so they do have a grocery component, and Natural Grocers are right there, so those are probably the two most in the immediate vicinity.
I'm just kind of wondering why we're being so dense with housing and not breaking some of it up with live-work space or other businesses.
Sure.
Because this is just driving through there, it's like, first of all, you can't get around anywhere. The streets don't go through or anything. And it's just so high, dense. Even with a traffic generation report, you've got to assume that there's going to be traffic.
Sure.
So I was just curious what. And then what's the bulk plane, if any, on these 35 height?
So no bulk plane proposed in this area. Currently, the bulk plane only applies to single-family homes in the R1C and R3 zone districts.
Okay.
Which I can't think of where the closest R1C or R3 zoning is to this area.
So these could be straight up 35 feet, flat roof,
Sure.
and then, okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Leo? Commissioner Weaver? I just had a couple questions. The first one is on the following condition number 1, was that something that I assume you ran by the town's attorney,
By who?
the city's attorney?
No, we didn't. We don't probably need to. It's just sort of to Mr. Dorsey's point, we don't want to entitle something or take it too far along if it's not developable.
I just want to make sure that we're not denying.
Due process.
Yes.
So the alternative would be that Quail Street is fully encumbered on the subject property, and they can do that design, but we just need to have some resolution to where Quail Street is at the appropriate time.
Okay. And then, how far, this is, remind me, how far is this to the TOD station?
I believe this corner right here is within a fourth of a mile, or not a fourth of a mile, a half a mile. So between a little bit more than half a mile.
Okay. And then on I know this is, we're just looking at the ODP, but do you know, just, I guess, generally, looking at the single-family attached, specifically on the facing east towards that Pearson Court, would there be, excuse me, potentially any doors that would face those single-family detached, or the row of the single-family, like 14 through 10, if they look west, what are they going to see? Are they going to see a side of a house and a alley, or are there going to be? Because my understanding there's no homes yet south of the public right-of-way of like 9 and 10, correct?
There's an existing home.
But there's, I think, okay.
I'm sorry, I'm reading through because I know that we talked about this, and for the life of me, I can't remember where exactly we landed. Lauren, do you remember off the top of your head where we landed on that issue?
Can you advance the slide to show the site plan? I'm not completely clear on the question, maybe.
Oh, maybe if you want to, I think you're asking if there will be front.
Yeah, I'm just looking at this, and I'm kind of making some assumptions that generally probably 1 and 2 that are on the west side, that there's probably going to be some doors that probably face that Quail Street,
Correct.
potentially some porches.
Yes.
And then as you go north, number 3 and 4, those are probably going to have some porches that are with doors that are probably going to face out to the north of the single-family detached, and this in the same opposite going to the south. My question is on the east side that you're going to have these single-family detached, and when they look west, are they going to be able, basically, are they going to be able to interact with neighbors that are going to be on their porches, or are they just going to be staring at the side of a building with alleys? That's my question.
There's no provision in the ODP that would that would dictate sort of what the side-facing elements of the townhomes need to include, whether it's just the side or the porches.
Okay.
We're particularly sensitive to that when you have an interface of existing single-family and new townhomes. A little bit less so in a scenario where it's sort of, buyer beware. When a single-family purchases, they sort of know what they're getting into as this neighborhood functions. Our goal in working through the site plan over the last 6 months was to ensure that there are as few driveways oriented to public street as possible. And so that is sort of the last side that feels more like a side. But we've been trying to eliminate, sort of sensitive to the Arvada frontages to the north and the east, and then sensitive to what those other 3 sides, public streets, feel like with having doors and porches. So certainly sort of the most underwhelming potentially, but there's nothing that prohibits them from orienting those end units if they wanted to towards Pearson Court.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions I have. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just had one more question that came to mind. I know on the first sheet of the ODP, under drainage considerations, it notes that detention facilities proposed to be located in the southeast corner of the property, and the project location is described on that first sheet just as a rectangle. But I am noticing here on the ODP sheet 2, the legend doesn't really make it clear. It says the property line and City of Wheat Ridge boundary are the same, but that's obviously not the case on the south border of the property, because the south border of the property just to the south of the south property line is also City of Wheat Ridge. So I'm assuming this solid thick line is a property line, correct?
Correct. Yep.
Okay, now then, so if that's the case, the detention pond here seems to be located on the ODP, not on the subject's property, but on the neighbor's property.
Correct.
Okay, so there appears to be an inconsistency between what we have on the first sheet under drainage considerations, stating that the detention facility will be located in the southeast corner of the property, and what's described visually on the ODP on sheet 2 with the detention pond outside the property. So I think that needs to get resolved.
We can correct that wording. So we did intentionally draw the boundary of the ODP as that square shape. It's probably just a issue with the wording. It's okay. In the same way that Quail Street is outside the subject property, a facility that serves the site, it's okay that the detention be outside the ODP boundary. That entire southern lot will be included in the plat and create the appropriate tracks and easements so that this detention facility always serves this ODP. But that's a very good catch on the wording of how we describe the location of the detention pond relative to the subject property.
Because just the way it appears on sheet 2, it looks like you're dumping all your water into the neighbor's backyard.
It does.
And so what you're saying is that detention pond, that little dog leg there in the southeast quadrant, that is part of the subject property? Or is it not?
No, it's not. That solid dark black line is the terminus of the ODP. So the language should read something like, a portion of the detention pond will be located in the southeast boundary of the subject property. The majority of the detention pond and an additional extension of Pearson Court will be located outside of the boundary of the ODP adjacent to the site, something like that.
Okay.
So if you want to add that as a condition, that we just clarify the language of of the location of the pond, then that would be something we could require that gets done before this gets recorded.
And is the ownership the same for the plot, the land to the south, as who owns the land up here that we're developing?
So there's 3 separate ownerships currently on the land. They will all have to sign off on this ODP document, so they all are aware of kind of what's going on here.
Okay.
And then, as Lauren said, this full kind of third property that isn't part of the ODP, but where the detention pond goes, will be part of the subdivision. So we can, legally break this section off from the existing parcel that's there.
Okay. All right. Thanks for clarifying that. All right. Thank you.
And then I had one request. Would it be possible to add on sheet 2 Quail Street and I think probably 54th on the north? Yeah, labels. Just that would kind of help out. Thanks.
Yep.
Are there any other questions for staff? Thank you. We will now hear from the applicant. If you'd like to come forward, and please state your name and address for the record.
My name is Summer Clark, and though I currently reside in Glen, Montana, I am registered to receive mail at my family's estate at 5392 Quail Street in Wheat Ridge, where I've lived through most of my formative years. Though traveling and living in other states and countries over the more recent years, I have always returned to the farm and my family that lived there and the roots it has held for myself and my family over decades past. So I'm showing a little slideshow with this so you can see some of the history. I heard a question regarding some of that, and it's covered in this statement. My family's estate has been fondly called the farm, as for more than 50 years my family has lived and grown up there, along with a variety of goats, chickens, ducks, geese, turkeys, rabbits, horses, and once we even raised pigs. The original house, garage, and barn were built on the farm in the early 1920s, made primarily of river rock and cement. My father was a builder by trade, so he remodeled the house and has since built other structures, most of which today are more than 40 years old. Our neighbor, bordering to the south of us, also included in this application, has older structures for farm animals whose home was built in the early 1950s. Whoops. Do that again. Okay. Yeah. Okay, here we go. This picture was taken in 1978. Our land was surrounded by more than 100 acres of open space, some preserved by a 100-year pledge barring development, where farmers gleaned alfalfa, and in more recent years, where the wild horse rescue was allowed use. For their horses to roam, some land was utilized by the late Colorado State Ridge Home, and beyond that, more vast acreage of undeveloped land that was filled with deer, fox, and beautiful wildlife that were driven away first by the Rainbow Ridge development in the early 1980s, later followed by the Skyline Estates development in early 2000. These beautiful creatures are rarely seen anymore near the farm on the hill, having been driven away from there by those developments. This was my playground, where I rode horses and explored the fox dens while watching the deer early in the mornings. When my family was approached by Melody Homes with their proposal to build Skyline Estates in the late 1990s, my family worked with Melody Homes and did not object to the development, even giving them an easement vacation they needed. We realized that more people beyond just us should be given the right to live and enjoy the beauty of the ridge and the enjoyment of having a home located close enough to the mountains while also having a short commute to Denver. We looked at the developing community as a whole and not at our personal desire to keep it as it was for ourselves. The Skyline Estates development broke apart our enjoyment of the ridge, the beauty of the wildlife that once lived there, and flailed in the midst of my memories, exploring the hills and their ravines, riding horses over and around the top of the ridge, through the dry lake, and down the hill to the ravines along it, where Rainbow Ridge now sits. Chasing the goats over the top of the ridge, now developed as part of Skyline Estates. And the best memories of sledding from the top of the ridge down it, towing my sled back to the top, and sitting down to watch the magnificent lights on the mountains to the west, Arvada's community on the hills to the north, and the valley below. All these views are now the views that our neighbors that live along 54th Avenue enjoy, while all we see is their homes sitting along the ridge that we once knew and loved. We have come to realize that there comes a time when the farm lifestyle in suburbia becomes obsolescent. Then is when governmental bodies help in promoting health, safety, and welfare of their citizens, when the keeping of farm animals attracts rodents and dangerous wildlife like rats and coyotes. Then the peaceful suburban life surrounding the older farm lifestyle is more challenged by the potential health risks that rats bring and the danger to dog and cat pets that coyotes bring. This realization, along with the many complaints my family was bombarded with, whether it was for an escaped goat or the roosters crowing in the morning, brought us to seriously consider what we never had before, to let our memories go, and consider what would be better for the community that we allowed to grow around us, while looking toward creating a new and a better horizon for the land we loved and grew up on. We found a solution that would do all of this for the betterment of our neighborhood in its health, safety, and welfare by creating a development to replace a dead-end peninsula area of Wheat Ridge with a fluent new housing plan, with neighborhood harmony in mind, and with thoughtful design and aesthetics, which is in stark contrast to the land's current zoning and use. On a wider scale, this new plan was designed also to complementarily match Wheat Ridge's master plan and the Ward Station vision. For health, the development will enhance the neighborhood, cleaning up close to 100 years of farm and other debris, its aesthetics, and the health concerns it raises for the area. watershed from along the ridge flowing into a drainage easement engineered jointly for our Skyline Estate neighbors and our properties should be significantly decreased with the Quail Run improvements, swells, and detention pond, as well as transferring to our easterly neighbors less debris to clean up in their backyards after strong rainfalls. Safety. The development will bring in necessary fire hydrants while eliminating dying trees and underbrush that may be hazardous for fire, while enhancing and beautifying the area with carefully planned and cared for green spaces. Welfare. The development will open the area with fresh, new, and beautifully designed housing that will aesthetically enhance and exponentially add value to the neighborhoods, both present and future, that surround it. We have chosen to work with Wonderland Homes to develop Quail Run because we have seen the planning and design of their projects principally directed at the functional, aesthetic use and preservation of the land they have developed, always creating functional open spaces for their communities to enjoy. We hold strongly to the same values they do, which we believe will be a beautiful enhancement to the community and a new legacy for our properties. And we want to thank the Wheat Ridge planning staff, who have given us an immense amount of patience while working with us over the past year and a half through so many site plan amendments and changes to help us balance Wheat Ridge policies and standards with our goals for this project. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Bowden, Commissioner Bucknam, Commissioner Dorsey, Commissioner Vaught, Commissioner Voss.
Yes, that was a good hearing from the original owner. Was the 1885 part of your family?
1885 was E.G. Tost. He came from Sweden.
But not
I
your-
have a little Swedish, but no, he's not a direct relative.
All right. So can we speak to the owls and the trees that were talked about as the vintage, keep some, plant some? Can you speak to that a bit?
I can. Well, first, I would like to say that a lot of those were there before the Skyline Estates was built. And a lot of that is gone because of what their development was. There are some trees down near Ridge Road, and a lot of the owls have moved there. In fact, I just spoke with one of the neighbors in the Skyline Estates who have had some new little baby owlets that were born this last year down there. And so the owls have kind of moved. They will continue to move to where the green belts are and the green spaces are, just like all the other animals have.
And is there some of that around? I didn't necessarily see green belts and open space
Well,
that
down
isn't.
below, actually in that one picture of the neighbors on 54th Avenue, I don't know if you saw that, I can bring that up again. There is the Rainbow Ridge Playground and that whole area down below. And you see that also, let's see, more closely. Okay, so down here, all of this area, this is where the playground is, down here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and so then there is a little walkway area down in this area. But then again, that's the Van Bibber Trail, and the trail goes all the way back
Okay.
in, to the foothills, and it's quite a beautiful place to.
How do you access that from?
Actually, right here. Okay, so this is the Skyline Estates. Here's the 54th Avenue. This is where our property is. And then we go down here, and then there's the little trail. You see that? Okay. And then you can go on to the other trailheads, and it continues on and on and on. It's nice access, but also in the future plans, there, especially through Quail Street coming through, and then there will be potentially another trail that connects this way.
Oh, okay.
We have been talking with the developer to the west, and we have an agreement that we've been working on for Quail Street, and that should be done very soon, I believe.
And then if I could ask a question more specifically to the traffic study as to when, where, and the dates, and how
That's-
long the study was, and,
Our engineer did the study, and they have that report.
thank you.
So there wasn't actual existing traffic counts performed. We don't require that unless you have an estimated generation of 60 trips or more in your peak hour.
and this is anticipated to generate about 37 trips in the peak hour. So it didn't trigger the requirement to do a detailed traffic impact analysis.
What are your peak hours?
It's between 4 and 6 p.m. It's generally a 1 hour window within that time frame, and you have 37 trips, and then I think the AM peak hour was 30 trips. You have a total of, I think, 220 trips a day.
And, I'm sorry, that didn't trigger the 60-trip requirement?
No, the 60 trips has to be within a 1 hour period.
Oh, okay. When was that traffic analysis done?
I'm not sure. Summer might be able to tell you that, but we received it maybe 2 months ago.
I believe it was December maybe or January.
Yeah, it looks like January, end of January.
And then what's the area in which you do that study on? What are the boundaries? of
It's
that?
you're just looking at the property, and you're using the ITE trip generation manual, so it's based on what's going to be built, single-family homes, multifamily homes, so it's pretty standard. It's an objective number. It's not something that's, subjective. You can go and look in a manual, and you'll come to 37 trips if you were to go do it yourself as well.
So if you physically sat there and counted the traffic, you're saying you could still get the 37 trips?
So, well, this isn't existing traffic. This is what's anticipated that this project will generate. So it'll generate an additional 37 trips in the peak
Okay.
hour.
That's what you're saying, all right, thank you. So nothing as to what is already happening in the whole neighborhood, all the developments considered, there's been no traffic study on what that generates at this time?
Correct.
So that if you're adding 37 to a 200 trip generation, you're at 237 now. So that's what I was trying to figure out.
Yeah, you're correct. Existing traffic wasn't really looked at in this instance.
I'm wondering why not, considering.
Yeah, so we can explain that a little bit. So two things. West 54th Avenue and Ridge are both collectors. So they're not local streets, they're higher traffic volume streets, both in Arvada. The difference between, as Jordan was saying, a trip generation study and a full traffic impact is just how many trips from a formula adopted by IT, Institute of Traffic Engineers, predicts the number of trips based on specific land uses. So if you're below that 60 trip quota for an hour, our city policies would indicate that you're not a big enough project to have a significant enough impact based on that being a collector street immediately adjacent. I think we talked about this a little bit with the commission for a project closer to the TOD, but we do now have an executed MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, between the City of Wheat Ridge, the City of Arvada, and Jefferson County, with the intent that in the next year or so we'd be doing a regional traffic study, because the only way to address some of these infrastructure issues is to look far beyond the boundary of just this single development. So that thesince we talked to you about that last, I think was in December, that agreement has been executed. But this individual project doesn't contribute, theoretically, does not contribute enough trips at the peak hour to warrant further analysis, which would include the kind of counting you're talking about, especially given that it's a collector as the adjacent street.
All right, thank you.
Commissioner Leo? Commissioner Weaver? I have no questions, thank you. Did the commissioners are all good? No other questions? Okay. I will now open up the citizens forum. Are there any citizens that have signed up to speak? Okay. And before I start, I'm going to have, with the applicant staff and anyone from the public who plans to testify or comment, please stand and raise your right hand. Yeah, anybody that signed up or wants to do you swear to tell the truth in this matter as you know it? I do. Thank you. Okay, first on the list is a Susan Wilson. Please come to if you want to speak, please come to the podium. and state your name and address.
My name is Susan Wilson. I live at 5373 Parfit Street in Skyline Estates in the city of Arvada. My property backs to the proposed Quail Run development in Wheat Ridge. And I'm going to read this in the interest of time because I know I have only about 3 minutes, and there's more detail if you care to ask. In my letter to Wheat Ridge Planning prior to the December 5th neighborhood meeting, I listed 3 concerns: density, property line, and drainage. First, I would like to thank the developer for revising the site plan to place single-family homes on the north side, as well as the east side of Quail Run, as a buffer to the single-family homes in Skyline Estates. However, I do still have concern about the level of density, particularly 3-story townhomes. That height seems rather imposing, even overwhelming, in our less dense neighborhood. Regarding the property line, Skyline properties on the west side of Parfit Street are bordered on the west by the city line between Arvada and Wheat Ridge. I would like to know if the wood fences presently along the back of our properties on Parfit Street represent the boundary of the developer's site, or if the boundary actually lies any distance west of the fences, which we believe it does. To verify the exact property line, I request that the developer provide her survey and an improvement location certificate to Parfit homeowners prior to public hearings for the Quail Run subdivision plat. Regarding drainage, I have read the developer's drainage report. I have also met with the City of Arvada engineer who gave preliminary approval. Provided the developer gets approval from Parfit Street homeowners and the Skyline HOA, if required, which it is, for any modifications proposed to be made in the drainage easement that are located within the backyards of our properties. I support the condition regarding drainage design stated in the Wheat Ridge Planning Division staff report, and that was condition number 2, which has been up on the screen. If final utility and/or drainage designs affect off-site property owners, written authorization shall be provided from those owners prior to public hearings for the Quail Run subdivision plot.
Thank you. Next is a Tim Bottomley. Bottomley, thank you.
Good evening. I also have written comments that I will turn in. Excuse me? My address is 11191 West 54th Avenue in Arvada, and I'm located just across 54th Avenue from the northwest corner of this proposed development. I have written comments also that I will leave. I'll just want to paraphrase just a couple things from it. I attended the December open house type meeting they had, and we also, as a group on our street, have a letter we had, several had co-signed about our original concerns when the townhomes were proposed along 54th Avenue. We do appreciate that the developer has changed that to make that single-family houses now. Some of the questions that you as a commission have brought up, a planning board, excuse me, are the same ones I've been thinking about. The fence along 54th Avenue, that whole jagged boundary in common between Arvada and Wheat Ridge, and who is going to be responsible for what on streets and maintenance and snow plowing, and if you have to call for police on something, who do you call related to that because of the boundary? The other related to traffic, and one of the things on this is this developer, and I've also been looking at the proposed development on the area to the west of it, the Haskins Station proposed development. They are talking about some of the traffic, but they use current traffic reports, and that is going to, I really believe, dramatically change once, or maybe if, the G line ever becomes open. That's just with the stuff right now. Once things are going to change, even with just that, and then particularly when Quail Street becomes a through street, it will be a lot more traffic going on as people not related to this neighborhood are just trying to travel through it, the easiest ways through the area. And the final thing was just, and some of my comments, I was not sure if they're more appropriate for a specific development plan or if they're for the more outlying development plan. I wasn't sure that I addressed the issue about the cottonwood trees. And then also with those existing buildings up there, the only specific request I have is, since they are old, they probably contain asbestos. So I do hope before they're demolished that there is an appropriate asbestos abatement plan related to it, particularly if it gets in the air, because I am immediately north of it. So, and thank you.
Thank you. Next is Mike Wheeling. Wheeling, okay, thank you. Please state your name and address.
Mike Wheeling, 5006 Parfait Street, Wheat Ridge. I'm along with Summer. I grew up in this neighborhood. My dad, who died last year, lived there for 55 years. I too, my dad used to cut the hay in those fields that were to the west of this. And when I was a kid, there was a big barn and a farm up there from the state for the dairy. We used to go up there and get baby calves that we raised. And, you know, I've seen this whole area, you know, become what it is houses and industry. And, you know, I think Summers just really tried to blend this in with what's going on around it. And so I'm for it. Just, you know, it's the open land is going to be gone, and that's just the way it is. So, thank you.
Thank you. Greg Dunkelberger.
Good evening. Greg Dunkelberger, 5320 Newcomb Street. We're in one of those little things, Mrs. Voss, that you wondered why we're in Wheat Ridge and not in Arvada, but we are Wheat Ridge. I'm just east of this Dunkelberger. So I would like to go on record as I am opposed to this development. I think it should all be single-family homes, and let me say why. To the very south, the new development just off Ridge, the Remington Homes, I believe, is the developer there. Those are all single-family homes. Just to the north, there's going to be that vacant spot, and then the planned development that you're considering tonight with only 14. The townhomes are just out of character with our neighborhood. Just tell you that. There was an informational meeting held either end of the summer or early fall by the developer of the Haskins property that was held at the Apex Fieldhouse. Huge amount of dissatisfaction with that plan. And I know they haven't had a formal meeting, but that will be well attended, and the residents of Arvada will fight that. It should all be single-family homes. That's all I can say. Thank you.
Thank you. Christia Chase. No comment?
She's in the hall. Maybe you could, yeah, there we go.
You could give your name and address, please.
Christia Chase, I live in Cherry Creek. I just wanted to say...
And your address?
Oh, sorry, 3329 East Bayard Avenue.
Thank you.
Number 818, Cherry Creek, Denver, 80209.
So, I mean, obviously we're not current residents of Wheat Ridge.
Well, I think it'd be best if we had Christia. She can speak. Yeah, you can go. You can, and we'll give you 3 minutes. And then if he wants to talk, he can state his name and address, and we can have him go on record too. Thank you.
I'm just in favor of it because we are obviously a single family looking for a place outside of the Denver area that we can start a family at. We have 2 dogs too, so being in the city is very hard. Where this quail run is, it's going to be close to trails, a playground, the light rail, which is great to get to work. There's a fire station close by, so as far as a young couple starting family, it looks pretty good. I don't talk in public very often.
You did get good. Thank you. And did you want to go, sir? You want to state your name and address and comment?
Chris Bobek, also at same address, 3329 East Leon. Like I think she said, we're kind of looking outside of Denver. Cherry Creek has been expensive. Right now we live in a studio apartment with a kiddo and 2 dogs. There's a park next door there, but we're kind of looking at places, near developments, near light rails, and just options. We have a friend that's very close in Arvada, Old Town Arvada, and I mean this area in general. We've hung out. It just seems, like a great place, great town. There are Super Target, the shops downtown look great in Old Arvada. I know it's all kind of encompassed in one area, but seeing the new rails go through and stuff, it's just convenient. We have 1 car. When I head to work with 1 car, she's stuck at home with a kiddo. It's kind of an option for us. New developments that I can take a light rail to work and leave the car, vice versa. It's just trying to think, our future. So we just thought it was interesting, and our friends had kind of said maybe we should pop in and see what's going on with it. So we thought we'd stop by. Seems interesting. So there's for it.
Thank you.
Your time.
Bob Vance. No comment at this time. Thank you. Terry Krieger Hieni.
I live at 11101 West 54th Avenue, right across the street. I have to agree with the gentleman that said we need to just put single-family homes in there. We keep stacking up these houses and our streets can't take it on. Yeah, we got a train going in, but there's enough traffic going on. There's apartments going up off of 58th Avenue. There's apartments over there across the street in Wheat Ridge. I think we need to just keep it simple, put homes in there, quit stacking things up. It's just getting too populated. That's all I have to say. Oh, it's
Thank you. Joel Zubke.
Hi, Joel Lubker, Lubker. I thought that was a sign-up sheet, but I'll say something anyway.
Could you give your address, please?
I'm sorry, 5352 Quail Street, where the development to the south. As far as I think it's a good deal. I think she's done very well, Summer, and the developer, to put single houses and around all the perimeter areas to make. You always heard it's a price point, and I think they've done very well to make it work. That's all.
Thank you. Greg Scola.
I'm sorry, I signed the wrong sheet.
Okay, thank you. Dennis Peter.
Dennis Peter, 11131 West 54th Avenue.
In Wheat Ridge or Urbana?
Arvada.
Thank you.
I just want to start off by thanking Summer and the staff for taking our considerations in on putting a buffer zone between 54th and the development. It shows that she's willing to work with the neighborhood, and we appreciate that. I would also like to just say that there is concern in the neighborhood about the density of the property. I understand that there's a need for housing, especially multifamily housing. And the only criticism I would offer on this proposed plan is that if it's a 3-story complex, that we could reduce that to 2-story. It would be more complacent or compliant with the rest of the neighborhood. They are all 2-story homes, and even the condos that are down on Ridge Road across from the fire department are 2-story condos.
Thank you. Julie, Peter?
Julie Peter, 11131 West 54th Avenue in Arvada, Colorado. I do thank Summer for making the change for us on 54th Avenue. We appreciate that. I am still concerned about cross-through traffic off of Ridge Road coming through Quail onto our street. I'm very concerned about cross-through. I don't think your traffic studies can show anything like what it's going to be once this is all developed, so I'd like some additional consideration for that. Open space, 30% open space. Open space to me means public access. I didn't see hardly any public access for that 30% open space. I would like to see more open space be put in those areas, and also very concerned about the density, the level of the homes, and as many townhomes as there are. We were told they were quadplexes. Now are they sixplexes? Very concerned about the density and the number in that very small acreage. It's only 6 acres, and I think the density is a huge concern. Thank you.
Thank you. Marianne Rodriguez?
Marianne Rodriguez, 11171 West 54th Avenue, Arvada. And I, too, appreciate the fact that there's going to be single-family homes along 54th and the east side. I also would like to see single-family homes. I personally am a lover of land, too. Summer, I have horses, and, I'm bummed that there's not a lot of land. So I would hope you would take that into consideration too, to maybe just do some single family and have more land where maybe people could have more animals. It is rural. I just think that single family homes just are conducive to just the beauty of Wheat Ridge and Arvada, and it just makes me sad that, everything is just so dense, and I don't think the traffic is well studied either, and I think the schools are going to be overpopulated, and the grocery stores. So I just would like to see less population and more beauty. And I'm sad about the owls too. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. That's everyone I have on the sign-up list. Is there anyone that was not on this list that still wishes to come forward and speak? Okay, let's, I'm going to close the citizens forum, and then we're going to go through these questions. The first one was talking about the Parfit boundary had come up, and I wasn't quite clear about that question.
Yeah, so I've actually, I have spoken with Susan a couple of times, sorry. So we have a survey for the property, but I'm not a surveyor, so I can't tell exactly where those lines are. So we spoke about, if this proceeds forward in the next round of submittals with the specific development plan, having something in place that shows where their fences are. I think the main concern is that there will be this odd, 1 foot gap in between fences that's just kind of this no man's land. So just making everyone aware of that ahead of time so they can work with the developer, and however that needs to kind of shake out. So I think I had originally mentioned an ILC, but I talked to the surveyor on staff, and he mentioned requesting that maybe the applicant with their survey for their their plat and specific development plan, have the surveyor draw in the improvements that are along the boundary of the property, so we would know exactly where the fence is. And I think that might be a reasonable request to ask of the applicant in their next round of submittal.
And then what are the what is the procedure legalities of the first one? I think it was Susan Head asked, wanted a survey certificate provided by, I think, provided to the homeowners, and that I think it sounded like she even wanted the homeowners to be able to sign off on that survey before anything could be built.
So I think maybe, are we talking about the drainage?
So still for the survey, what we'll be requesting, we have the ability to request specific details above and beyond our standardized checklist, so we'll have those appurtenances that Zach's mentioning shown, and then that all becomes public record, so it would certainly be available to Ms. Wilson or anyone else in the neighborhood.
Okay, thank you. And then there was a comment too about having the other homeowners having to provide written authorization prior to the applicant's approval. And these are, my understanding is they could be even city of Arvada residents.
So my understanding was for the drainage, which is a condition of approval.
Okay.
We wouldn't typically require neighboring authorization for development. But for the drainage, because it will impact, as Ms. Wilson said, there's an easement that is actually in the backyards of the Parfit Street homes that I believe this development will have to tap into somehow to get the drainage out to wherever it flows. I'm sorry, I'm not in public works. I don't know exactly about drainage, but it needs to flow somewhere to the southeast. So there will be several property owners who may be impacted by needing like manholes, I think, in their backyards, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, so it'll just be actually just one property where the detention basin outfall ties into that existing channel. So the flow rates will actually be reduced from what's in there now due to the detention basin.
Is that a city of Arvada resident or Wheat Ridge?
It is. It's city of Arvada. It's on Parfit Street, just kind of at the southeast corner of the property. I'm not exactly sure which resident it would be at this time.
So is that a done deal? Has that resident person?
I believe that there
granted
was some
access?
correspondence, and I think the person was open to that.
We'll be obtaining a final drainage report as part of the next application. So there has been, I know Ms. Clark, the applicant, has been doing a lot of outreach so that folks are sort of aware that they'd be engaging further. And I believe that Ms. Wilson's request is probably consistent with our condition too, where we also the city wouldn't want to be in a position where we're approving a final drainage design impacting off-site private property without specific written authorization.
Okay. And then I think there's a question about the fence along 54th. I'm assuming that's proposed, and that was probably the same question with the boundary, perhaps, survey?
I believe so. So I believe Commissioner Bucknam asked earlier about fencing. That will be determined during the specific development plan. I do know currently the existing fence on that property, I believe it's owned by the HOA, and I believe the property owner or applicant, Ms. Clark, is aware of that and will work with the HOA as to who takes care of what, if that comes down or remains, or I'm not really sure how that shakes out. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
One of the last questions had to do with the requirement for open space. One was, it was a two-part one that the interpretation from the public was that the open space should be open to the public and not necessarily private.
Sure. So there will be public open space areas. So what is shown on page 2 of the outline development plan, and I'll bring it up on the screen so everyone's on the same page.
While Zach's pulling up that image, open space has come up a couple times tonight. As the commission knows, the purpose of a planned development is not to circumvent the city's standard zoning. So we always use our standard zoning development standards as a baseline. In our multifamily zone district, R3, the minimum open space requirement is 30%. So that's how we landed at that number for the multifamily component of this project. And then in terms of it being public, I think you can illustrate what probably would be or wouldn't be.
Sure, and also just to add to that, the way that we're calculating it is the same way that we would calculate something under the R3. So the inclusion of those side yards and what I kind of noted would be maybe front yards is the same way that we would calculate that for multifamily development in R3. And then what the applicant is proposing is an actual open space corridor here, where front doors, I believe, are planned to face the open space, or actually they're required to, I believe, per one of these notes. And then it will open up into this larger open space. All of this is public open space for the community as well as the neighboring communities. So while the full 30% may not be, public or may not feel public, right? It might be, near someone's side of their house. There is a large public component kind of built into this outline development plan, which if you approve will be, what we'll be looking at when we approve the specific development plan then, next.
So the 30% that's calc just on the single family attached, correct?
Correct, yep.
Okay.
And then for the single family detached, we calculate that the same way that we do all of our single family detached zone districts, which is by maximum lot coverage. And then they're required to have the same landscaping as the rest of the city. So 100% of the front yard needs to be landscaped, and then 25% of the total lot with 100% of the front yard landscaped is the requirement. That's written in to those development standards on the right-hand side of the second page.
Okay. And then there's a comment about cottonwood trees. Is that, are there existing, I guess, cottonwood trees on the site, I would imagine?
I would believe so. I'm not sure the species of trees, but there are several trees on the property, yes.
Okay. And the cottonwood trees, I'm assuming that those are all going to be probably removed. I assume they're probably large trees.
They are very large trees, and I would presume that they, yes, would be taken down.
Yeah. The city doesn't have a tree protection ordinance that mandates or sort of dictates how trees are removed or replaced. It would be appropriate to allow the applicant to respond to some of these comments too, so maybe we could ask that of her.
Okay. And then is the cottonwood tree, is that a favorable tree for the city?
We do have, I think that's one of the few species that we have limitations on, just because it's, for lack of a better term, maybe a nuisance tree in terms of what it drops. So we don't typically see cottonwoods in new developments.
Because of the seeds and the pollen and the root upheaval of sidewalks, probably.
Correct.
And then there was a question about who to call, I guess, for maintenance, and I assume that would depend on which city you live in.
Sure, right, yeah, I mean, if you call 911, I think I don't know how that is responded to. I know several cities, it's kind of outside the scope of this, but several cities in the Jefferson County area have recently moved to a new model where they're all the dispatch centers are centrally located. So the city of Wheat Ridge no longer has a dispatch center. It's all centrally located in Jefferson County. So I think that integration of all of those centers will actually help situations like this, where there are jagged boundary lines. They'll be able to send who needs to be there. As far as maintenance,
would that be code? I don't know if that was interpreted as code compliance. The maintenance question.
So code compliance for the subject property, you would call City of Wheat Ridge code enforcement. If it's outside, then you would call City of Arvada code enforcement. Or code,
Thank you.
Yeah, code compliance officers.
Commissioner, I think the question, if maybe I heard it wrong, was regarding the maintenance of the streets.
Okay.
With shared.
No,
with
I
shared
think that was
city
another part of it
boundaries.
too.
I
The
think
maintenance of the streets. Who maintains?
Sure. So 54th is entirely within the city of Arvada, so that is Arvada's responsibility to maintain This public right-of-way, and Pearson Court are all within the city of Wheat Ridge. That would be on the city to maintain. And then Quail, I think, would take an agreement between the two cities. I know several of our streets border or on city boundaries. So like 26th Avenue is a boundary between Lakewood and Wheat Ridge. There's a couple others. Sheridan, for example, is between Denver and Wheat Ridge. So I think, in those cases, the cities have an agreement as to who plows what. If this is a street that will be plowed, I don't know where that falls into either of the cities' kind of hierarchies of streets that are plowed. And then as for the maintenance, I believe that is a similar situation.
Thank you. There's a question one gentleman asked about asbestos. Maybe that was something existing on site.
Yeah, so the building department, when you come in for a demolition permit, if there is a building over a certain age, which I believe both of these structures or all of these structures on this property would definitely qualify for, since I believe they're, one's 70 and one's closer to 100 years old, you have to have a state of Colorado asbestos report with your demolition permit. So we do not issue any demolition permits without that document or that approval from the state.
Thank you. And then the traffic, future traffic from Quail, there are some concerns about once that opens up, about predicting.
Sure, and as Lauren mentioned, there is an MOU between the cities and the county to move forward on setting those impacts. We do know that there are several developments in the area, and as each one comes in, right, I don't think any of the city codes contemplate multiple projects all coming in at once, so they all kind of look insular to themselves for traffic. So, the city of Arvada, city of Wheat Ridge, and Jefferson County, I think all recognize that, and that's why we have the memorandum of understanding between the cities, and are moving forward on a regional kind of traffic study. Correct me if I don't know the details of it, so correct me if I'm wrong, Lauren, but to study the impacts on all of these streets and all of these areas that are shared between the three cities or the two cities and county. So correct, we don't have any information for you tonight, but the city, Arvada, Wheat Ridge, and Jefferson County are aware and actively working on studying everything that's going on in this area.
Thank you. And then one last question. Could you just briefly go over the density, the 3-story, why I think there are townhomes, why that's proposed in part, and it sounds like in the past maybe there was more townhomes, and why there's now some single family and some townhomes proposed.
Sure. So I could maybe also let the applicant speak to this because I'm sure it has a little bit to do with the pro forma. In the original, or maybe not original, but in the draft version that was brought to the neighborhood meeting in December, there were townhomes all along this 54th Avenue frontage with street parking along 54th Avenue. I think most of this was also townhomes with a few single-family homes, maybe here and scattered maybe here, I can't remember exactly. Due to some of the comments that we heard at the neighborhood meeting, we really pushed the applicant, or we didn't push her so hard. She was also willing to work with the neighborhood, understand that that was something that they were really wanting. So we were able to get, together working through several iterations of how do we make this work, able to get the townhomes insular to the site and border the north and eastern property lines with single-family homes. I can't answer why there's not all single-family homes. I think that's maybe more of an applicant question.
But maybe just a couple comments on why staff supports the design with a variety of housing types too. I know there's an exhibit in your packet that's not included in the slideshow that it shows a little bit of a broader context here. This property is equidistant between 2 transit stations, and I understand, a lot of the existing residents, likely the single-family neighborhoods were developed, and likely many of these residents moved in before transit was contemplated. So it's a changing area, and so what we've really tried to do from a staff standpoint, 2 things. City of Wheat Ridge is a little unique in that we have height and density caps in our charter. Arvada does not have that. Most communities do not have that. So the densities proposed are well under our maximum of 21 units per acre. We did a rough analysis of sort of all of the densities of surrounding neighborhoods and tried to strike a balance there in terms of what the density is achieved in this. I believe it's less than 10 units per acre. But in terms of the balance of townhomes and single family, it's that fine line of trying to identify density that is compatible with the neighborhood and also a transit supportive density, just given that the character of the area does change once the G line opens and comes in.
Thank you. Fellow commissioners, are there any other questions that need to be asked that I haven't asked? Okay, let's, at this point, I would entertain a motion. And please refer to the handout, revised handout for the motion.
All right, I'll make a motion. I move to recommend approval of case number WZ-17-11, a request for approval of the zone change from agricultural 1 to planned residential development with an outline development plan for property located at 5372 and 5392 Quayle Street for the following reasons. Reason 1, the proposed zone change will promote the public health, safety, or welfare of the community and does not result in an adverse effect on the surrounding area. Item 2, the proposed zone change is consistent with the goals and objectives of the city's comprehensive plan. Reason 3, the proposed zoning includes a circulation network that supports the city's goals related to bicycle and pedestrian connectivity. Reason 4, the proposed zoning establishes enhanced design controls related to site design and architecture that will result in a high-quality development. Reason 5, the criteria used to evaluate a zone change support this request with the following conditions. Condition 1, the Quail Run specific development plan and subdivision plat shall not be reviewed at public hearing until Quail Street has been dedicated as a public right-of-way on the adjacent property to the west or on the subject property. Condition 2, if the final utility and or drainage designs affect off-property site owners, written authorization shall be provided from those owners prior to public hearings for the Quail Run subdivision plat. Condition 3, revise single-family detached minimum rear yard setback to 15 feet. And condition 4, revise the language on sheet 1 of the ODP regarding drainage to reflect the correct position as indicated on sheet 2 of the ODP of the drainage area.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion?
I just want to say I really appreciate the applicants' work with the neighbors, as we've heard about, regarding the single-family and multifamily alignment within this subdivision. Looking at what you might see up on the screen there, this overview map, there is actually quite a mix of multifamily and single-family in here. If you go farther to the west, there's single-family and duplex areas. We have condos abutting single-family. And I do think with the location of this subject property equidistant between these two stations, there will be a nice mix of demand for both single-family and multifamily, and that's why I'm going to support this motion.
Any other? Go ahead.
I agree with changing from Ag 1 to residential development. However, I have concerns about the multifamily. Not only the density increase, but also it takes up more surface, it's also more surface land. There's less land to absorb water, so it increases the runoff. I just wanted, I'm not against changing it from Ag 1, but at this point, with the multifamily, I won't support it.
Are there any other discussions? Call for a vote.
Motion carried, 6-1.
Thank you. I don't know if the fellow commissioners want to make a motion for a short 5-minute break.
I would make a motion for a 5-minute break.
Second? And
Sure. Let's do it.
We're going to start the next hearing. I open the public hearing for case number WSP-17-09, an application filed by Quadrant Wheat Ridge Corners LLC for approval of a master sign plan for the Corners development at the southwest corner of West 38th Avenue and Wadsworth Boulevard, including 7690 Yukon Court, 3765 Wadsworth Boulevard, 3637 Wadsworth Boulevard, 3545 Wadsworth Boulevard, and 3501 Wadsworth Boulevard. And before we start, I'd like to swear everybody in. If the applicant, staff, and anyone from the public who plans to testify or comment, please stand, raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth in the matter as you know it? I do. Thank you. I now ask for the staff report.
Good evening. For the record, Lauren Michalak, Planning Manager with the City of Wheat Ridge Community Development Department. And I would like to enter into the record the contents of the case file, the zoning ordinance, and this digital presentation. Property is within the City of Wheat Ridge, and all appropriate notification requirements have been met. So we'll start, as we often do, first here with an aerial, just to get oriented to the site. As most of you probably know, if you've been driving by 38th and Wads, this is a very outdated aerial at this point in time. The subject property is outlined here in blue. North is to the top, 38th Avenue at the top of your screen, and Wadsworth shaded there in pink because it's a CDOT right-of-way. The red lines indicate the city's right-of-way. So this property comprises the Corners development. It was platted last year into the 5 lots and the 1 drainage tract that you're seeing here. It's about 14 acres in size, and it's been a project that's been in the works for many years now, with a variety of different land use applications that we've processed. We approved a site plan for the first phase of the development last year. That included the 4 buildings that you're seeing under construction today, with 3 smaller retail buildings at the hard corner and a larger anchor 35,000 square foot building here in the middle. We recently approved the site plan application for the residential component of the project, which will be down here at 35th Avenue. And I think we received that building permit application just this week. Signage has not been a part of those prior approvals. That's pretty typical. And on a site of this size, we have been encouraging the developer to submit a master sign plan. That's not a document that the commission sees very often because we don't have a lot of larger developments that merit a master sign plan. So I just want to describe pretty briefly what the purpose and process is for that type of document. So master sign plan is essentially like a planned development for signage. It's intended for properties that are over 2 acres in size, that are either commercial, mixed use, or industrial development, and are under unified control. And it's usually, we have one, for example, the Lutheran campus has a master sign plan. It's made up of a lot of different parcels, a lot of different buildings. The last one that the Planning Commission may have seen was for Kipling Ridge. That's the Sprouts development at 38th and Kipling. It's about half the size. But again, a property that has multiple lots or buildings and sort of benefits from having a few variances, so to speak, from our standard sign code, which works really well for a single lot on a single building and less well for these bigger developments. So master sign plan sort of supplements our code, proposes minimums and maximums. It can vary from the code. It doesn't change the zoning. It doesn't change the permitted uses. We're not looking at sort of the site design itself. It's really just about signage tonight. Master sign plans are required to be reviewed by the Planning Commission and the Planning Commission only, so you'll be the final approving body. They do get recorded at the county, so they do function as sort of a regulatory document. Modifications to the tenants, sort of the signed copy, don't require an update to the sign plan, but modifications to those few standards that we'll be looking at tonight would potentially have to come back to this board. So we'll walk through the document briefly. I know this is illegible, but the cover sheet, it's a 3-page document. The cover sheet here has the standard declarations that are required for a recorded document. And essentially the way that we frame a master sign plan is to say that all signage on the site shall comply with the city's sign code except as modified by this document. In this case, we have only 5 types of signs that are being modified through the sign plan. And those are summarized in the middle table and what we'll walk through here in a minute. I should mention, and it's mentioned in the staff report, it's a little bit of a funky timing because the next case you'll hear tonight is an update to our sign code. So what I've included in the staff report is an analysis so you understand where this falls relative to sort of both our current sign code today and what could be our sign code in just about a month or 2. Fortunately, for a lot of the standards that they're requesting, there's not a lot of difference in that analysis between the current and future sign codes. I'll focus really on what's specifically being proposed here, because that is really the intent of sort of, do these standards make sense for this property? The next sheet, the second sheet in the sign plan, includes a site plan, and it has a few images of some of the freestanding monument signs and the blade sign. So we'll start with the discussion of what those proposed regulations are for freestanding signs. What I'm showing here is how our current or future code would apply to the property. So for freestanding signs, we always allow them on a per lot and per street frontage basis. So you get 1 freestanding sign per lot. You get 2 freestanding signs if you have multiple street frontages. So for example, the lot down here, lot 4, has frontage on Wadsworth and on 35th, so it would get 2 signs. Lot 3 would get 1. Lot 1 would get 2. This lot would get 2. Lot 5 doesn't actually have any immediate adjacency because this is a street, so they arguably could have one. In any case, our regular code would say you can have 7 freestanding signs on these street frontages. Again, sort of works well for single lots, but not so well for a property that has a lot more internal functionality. So the image that is now on your screen is showing the internal grid. As you may recall from reviewing the subdivision plat or just sort of hearing about the project in general, there's been a lot of focus on how the site feels internally in terms of bike ped access, how the buildings relate to each other. So what's being proposed in terms of freestanding signs is to have several signs oriented to the street, so 4 oriented to the public street, and 2 sort of more internal to the site, and then a hierarchy of 3 different types of freestanding signs. We don't distinguish among freestanding signs in our code, but those 3 different types for this project are shown at the bottom. So the first one being what we're calling the campus corner ID sign here in the middle. It's not advertising for any single business. It's just sort of declaring the name. You think about like Belmar has one at the hard corner there at Alameda and Wadsworth. So this would be, it's a curved design. It's located in the landscaped area. It's at the hard corner of 38th and Wadsworth. And it provides a little bit of a buffer actually between what will be a plaza area and sort of the trafficked area on the streets. Just one of those signs on the project. The freestanding sort of primary sign that would be the largest multi-tenant signage, there's again only one of those proposed right here in the middle of the site along the Wadsworth frontage. It is proposed to be a little taller than what our normal freestanding sign standards would allow, but it's also the only one that they're proposing at that height. And this development will end up having about 70,000 square feet of commercial, so it's appropriate based on the sort of the scale of the development. The third category of freestanding signs is the secondary one. These 3 drawings are all at the same scale, so you can see quite a bit smaller than the other 2. Also multi-tenant signage and located sort of at strategic areas. The only sign that's not specifically detailed here would be the one that identifies the apartment building. It's just not far enough along to have a specific design. It would have to comply, or be consistent rather, in terms of materials and whatnot. And so it's that sign on the multifamily piece is expressed in terms of minimum maximum standards, which is how we typically articulate that in the sign code. A couple other features of freestanding signs. I mentioned they'll be cohesive with each other. The materials that are proposed do complement the material palette that's being used throughout the project. And the applicant has provided a prohibition on electronic message centers, or sort of those video display boards. So something that we freely allow in the sign code, but an additional sort of visual constraint here that will allow this to feel a little bit more unified in terms of the sign plan. Sheet 3 is the last sheet of the sign plan, and it also focuses on the freestanding sign. So again, I know this is illegible on the screen, but the reason we asked for these drawings was to demonstrate where specifically those 5 known signs would be relative to the property lines. Typically, our minimum setback for a sign is 5 feet. In this case, there are some setbacks that will be shorter than that. I believe the smallest was maybe 3 feet and a few inches. The property is zoned mixed-use commercial, so it requires that buildings be pushed closer to the street. That's what we want to see. They're doing what we want to see, but as you can imagine, having all the buildings closer to the street prohibits signage. So what we've done here is have them show where the proposed signs are relative to the site triangle, so we know that we're not creating a safety issue. But otherwise, staff feels like the reduced setbacks are appropriate just in terms of providing reasonable visibility and identification. I should probably mention the Public Works Department also looked at this, and they didn't have any concerns with the site triangle. And the one drawing that looks a little bit unusual to you probably is in the upper corner here, where there's 2 triangles shown that sort of overlap. So we had them do an analysis of the site triangle for where the curb is today on Wadsworth and where we think it would be when Wadsworth is widened, so that we know that we're not creating issues in the future. So I mentioned there are 5 categories of signs being addressed by this plan, and the next category is for wall signs. So for the code, our standard city code, both current and potentially future, what we allow is wall signs to face public streets or major interior drives. And when we say major interior drives, we really mean that network of sort of thick blue lines. We don't mean drive aisles in parking lots. In this case, the sign plan proposes that we also allow signs on those frontages adjacent to the parking lot. You can see with buildings B, C, and D sort of why that would be appropriate. They're being pushed to the street, which is what we want, but the primary entrances for customers are going to really be oriented towards where those customers are parking, so it would be appropriate for that to be a side of the building with a sign on it. We typically allow wall signs to be either channel letters, which is where you just have sort of extruded letters on a building, or a cabinet sign, which is when you have a framed sort of rectangle and then a plastic sheet in that rectangle that has the copy on it. Channel letters are the only thing that are being proposed here for wall signs, so that's a little bit more restrictive, but also certainly a visual enhancement to have some more consistency there. They're also proposing to limit the width of those wall signs so that there's sort of appropriate spacing between different tenants. So buildings B, C, and D, for example, will likely have anywhere from 2 to 4 tenants, and you don't, while we calculate wall sign based on the width of your tenant space, you wouldn't want the signage itself to extend all the way across that width. It would sort of, just visually, it would look awkward. So those 2 restrictions go above and beyond our normal code, and with those in place, they have requested that the wall sign allowance be increased to 1.5 square feet per linear foot. Our normal standard is 1 to 1. This is a similar type request that we entertained for Kipling Ridge, particularly when you have channel letters. Building H, which is highlighted in red here, I think I mentioned earlier, is the only anchor tenant. So it's a larger format retailer, 35,000 square feet. It's not uncommon for the larger format retailer, especially when it's set back from the street like this, to have a few different standards that would apply. So the sign plan acknowledges awning signs, which you're seeing here in red and white with like the cursive L, for example, and then potentially a mural, art mural flanking the main entrance. And then what they're showing here, and it's hard to read in sort of 2 dimensions, is the opportunity for an aluminum backer panel. So these are still channel letters, but in section view you see this teeny little sliver of material that will allow increased contrast in the channel letters as compared to the masonry that would be behind it. This image, we provided in the staff report in here just to give you an example of what those standards looks like. Sometimes it's hard to interpret what our written out standards are going to look like in practice. We don't like to record these types of documents or types of images in a sign plan document because that, as you can imagine, would require then an update just when the tenant changes. So for illustrative purposes, but certainly represents what the sign plan would allow. The other three types of signs that are addressed in the plan are leasing, blade, and window and door signs. And not a lot to go over here. Leasing signs are actually a category that we will not have in our future sign code because we're updating that, as you know, to be content neutral. Because a sign plan kind of functions like a plan development, the same Supreme Court decision does not apply. So they can create content-related categories, same as they likely have very specific content-related restrictions in a covenant, for example. So the leasing signs that are being proposed here would allow up to 4 signs on the property. The way that our code works right now and is proposed to work is to have temporary signs on a lot-by-lot basis. But as you can imagine, with a development that has 70, 80,000 square feet of commercial sort of oriented onto one end, it makes sense to have the 4 signs proportional to this amount of commercial development. So they've proposed standards for both freestanding and banner designs. Blade signs, so that uses the terminology in the updated code. Our current code calls it a projecting sign. And what they've done here is limit the size and shape of the sign so that there's some more visual consistency, so more restrictive than what the city would normally do. And they've increased the clearance from, I think our standard is 7 feet above a sidewalk. Here it would be 9. It's largely related to the architecture that they already know is planned for some of those buildings. And then lastly, window and door signs has sort of the least amount of change from our current code, but we recommended that they include these standards here, not knowing sort of what the outcome would be of the sign code update or the timing, frankly. So window and door signs are traditionally limited to 25% of the window or door, and that's the same here. What we've done in the sign plan and in the sign code you'll look at later tonight is distinguish between front of house windows and back of house windows. From an architectural standpoint, we have a lot of standards related to window transparency and wanting to sort of have that experience as a pedestrian of walking past a window versus walking past a solid, wall or masonry wall. But we also understand that most commercial activities are going to need some privacy for back of house function. So we've added language that allows an opaque privacy film that's a darker color that's interior mounted. So when you walk by, you can still sort of see your reflection. It feels like a window. And those are distinctly not signage because there's not any images or text on them. So just a couple additional notes that you probably read on the cover sheet. Again, all other types of signs would be regulated by our standard sign code. Specific copy, as I discussed in the Lucky's example, is not a part of the sign plan, so that can change as tenants change. And this document is recorded, so it'll be regulated. As a part of this being a public hearing, the property was posted for the 2 weeks leading up to tonight, and we haven't received any public comments. So that said, we are recommending approval of the master sign plan as it's presented with no additional conditions. The site is eligible for a master sign plan. I think I mentioned there's requirements of the types of the development and the size, and this meets those requirements. The plan, we've determined, does promote well-planned signage. It does a good job, I think, of requesting some increases and also incorporating additional restrictions that we don't otherwise usually do. And the plan is consistent with the intent of the sign code and really appropriate for a property or development of this size. That's everything I have. I can certainly answer questions, and we do have the applicant here tonight as well.
Thank you, Commissioner Bowden, Commissioner Buckton, Commissioner Dorsey, Commissioner Voss.
Yes. Can you explain a channel letter sign? I'm not quite visualizing what that is.
Sure. So for a channel letter, I'm not a sign producer, so this may not be how you actually make them, but it'd be kind of like if you just laser cut the exact letters out versus having them printed on a rectangular shape.
Is it like the magnetic letters we used to put up on the fridges?
Yes, thank you. So that's a pretty great example. So a magnet that, when you have just the individual letters as a kid that you're putting on the fridge, those are channel letters because the limits of that magnet is just the limit of the letter, versus getting a magnet that's a rectangle that would recite the entire alphabet on it. That's more of the cabinet design. So the difference being that you're seeing a lot more background images or typically background white space on a cabinet sign versus the letters, which are just strictly the letters onto the building.
I think you might want to think, if you've passed by a Starbucks lately, the letters that spell out Starbucks are sort of extruded out of, like the letter forms are extruded out and then they're illuminated on the end to spell out Starbucks. That's an example.
A single, each letter is single of its own, okay. I'm just curious, is this kind of the same thing we're going to see for Clear Creek Crossing? This kind of master signage plan?
It would be a property that'd be appropriate for that. I believe they included a lot of their signs in the outline development plan.
Oh.
But sort of in that chapter was similar to a master sign plan by acknowledging this is such a different beast. It needs to sort of have its own considerations.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Well, I thought the city was going to monument signs and not side of building signs or other large 28-foot, like the arch at the corner is going to be.
So all three of these signs would be considered monument signs.
Oh, they
because
would?
they're not pole mounted.
Oh, so they start at the ground and
Exactly,
go up?
where the
Okay.
base of the sign is equal to or maybe slightly wider than the vertical portion, that would be considered a monument sign.
And then is this brick down here where you have these signs pictured that have this like?
I believe so. Mhm.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
And then what's the rest of the sign? A plastic piece?
So this is a good actually example where these are essentially cabinet signs, right? So these are going to be plastic sheets for all the different tenants. And then these are architectural features on the side.
Of wood or metal?
The property includes largely brick, stucco, and stone.
Okay.
So it would be compatible with the primary materials being used on the buildings.
And then what's the height of that building that's there at the corner when the sign is at 28 feet? What's the height of the building?
The buildings so the taller primary sign that you're talking about is here, and the adjacent buildings have not yet been designed. This would all be a future phase of development. The single-story buildings over here, I believe, are maybe 24, 28 feet in height. Lucky's is much taller than that. But the immediately adjacent buildings have not been designed.
So the B, C, and D, what are those height? Because they're already up.
Yeah, I don't know those off the top of my head. I know they're at least 24 feet, if not taller, to the top of the parapet wall.
Okay, thanks.
Commissioner Leo? Commissioner Weaver? The only question I have is on the leasing signs. So it talks about that if once we go to our next case and we talk about updating the code, my only concern is there going to be any, is there going to be any potential issues with code enforcement? Is this site going to get calls because, hey, they're not in code compliance and
That's a good question. So we run into this on sort of a variety of properties where you know, a code enforcement officer drives by the site, doesn't know the zoning when they're driving by. So what they would typically do is come back and double check with us if they're seeing something. We only have maybe 4 master sign plans in the city.
Okay.
So we can let them know sort of where the rules might be a little different so that they're not doing an immediate sort of knee-jerk reaction to something that they don't need to be doing. Leasing signs tend to look a little bit, even though we classify them as temporary, they tend to look a little bit more permanent than, say, a banner or flutter flag. So
Okay.
It may be to our benefit that that's the category specifically exempted here.
Okay. Are there any other questions for staff? Okay, thank you. If the applicant would like to make a presentation, or if not, maybe the fellow commissioners might have some questions for you, if you could come forward. And state your name and address for the record.
Bob Turner, I'm the developer.
If you could raise your microphone a little bit, sir, thank you.
I don't
usually am not that tall. Bob Turner, I'm the developer, 981 South Park Drive, Littleton, Colorado, 80120. Regarding the signage, Lauren and I have always contemplated a master sign plan for the program, and that kind of drove some of the ways that we developed kind of the overall platting of the property. So instead of putting a bunch of different plats along Wadsworth Boulevard, where we could each have one pretty good sized monument sign, we decided to make it a more cohesive sign package that matched the architecture of the buildings that we're putting on the site. One thing that Lauren we were talking about architecture and what the monument signs are going to look like. This is our logo. This corner is at Wheat Ridge, and it's got different colors that it really kind of contemporary design logo. And then this portion of the sign, if I remember correctly, matches the architecture of the building. So it's going to be I don't know how to describe it, like a Plexan light that will be matching the architectural features of the building. So really distinctive, kind of modern. We're really, I think, enhance the character of the shopping center. If you've been down to in Glendale, there's development where there's 2 hotels, kind of at Cherry Creek Drive South and Colorado Boulevard. If you've ever driven through that development, we tried to bring some of the elements of the lighting from that development, to look at that because I really enjoyed that, into the buildings, but also into our signage. So that was kind of our thought from the beginning, in the many years of evolution for this project, was to have a master plan that kind of tied the entire development together.
Are there any questions for the applicant?
Do you guys want to know when we're going to be done? When we're going to open the shopping center? Well, we won't be many years until we open this center. We're thinking we're going to open the first 3 buildings, and Lucky's, we're going to turn the buildings over for tenant improvements. The first 3 on the corner, we're thinking at the end of May, beginning of May. And then, so it usually takes about 90 days for the restaurants and the retailers to build their space out, maybe 120 days. So you'll see those open hopefully around fall, maybe late summer, maybe when the kids are going back to school. And Lucky's, I think, is still planned for a mid-July opening. Got a lot of stuff we've got to complete, but the weather's been cooperating, so that's been one very good thing.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I will now open up the citizens forum. Are there any citizens that have signed up to speak? Is the gentleman next to, okay, there's nobody, correct? No one signed up to speak? No one, okay. I will close the citizens forum. At this point, I would entertain a motion.
I will make a motion. I move to approve case number WSP 17-09, a request for approval of a master sign plan for a unified development on property zoned mixed-use commercial, MUC, and located on the west side of Wadsworth between 35th and 38th Avenues, including 7690 Yukon Court and 3501, 3545, 3637, and 3765 Wadsworth Boulevard for the following reasons. 1, the site is eligible for a master sign plan. 2, the master sign plan promotes well-planned and well-designed signage. 3, the master sign plan is consistent with the intent of the sign code and appropriate for the context of the development.
Second.
Second that motion.
Any discussion? I thank the staff for a thorough analysis of the current sign code and what's proposed, and carefully thinking this through. Any other discussion? Call for vote.
Motion carried 7-0.
Thank you. Okay. I open the public hearing for case number ZOA-18-01, an ordinance amending Article 7 Sign Code of Chapter 26 of the Code of Laws, and ask for the staff report.
Alrighty, good evening again. For the record, Zach Wallace Mendez, planner with the Wheat Ridge Community Development Department. Tonight I am presenting case ZOA 1801, an ordinance amending Article 7 of Chapter 26 of the Code of Laws, also known as the Sign Code. I would like to enter into the public record the contents of the case file, the zoning ordinance, and this digital presentation. I guess the comprehensive plan doesn't need to go in. And all appropriate notification requirements have been met. Therefore, Planning Commission does have jurisdiction to hear the case.
So noted.
Just a quick background. This is similar to what we've seen before, but just quickly to summarize. In 2015, the Supreme Court decided on the case of Reed versus the town of Gilbert. Quickly, what that meant was the town of Gilbert sign code regulated signs based on their content. The Supreme Court ruled that this was prohibited government regulation of free speech and unconstitutional per the First Amendment of the Constitution. This overall decision, in addition to the individual justices' opinions on the decision, have prompted most cities across the country to remove content-based regulations from their sign codes. So, for example, in our current sign code, we regulate political signs differently than we regulate real estate signs, different than construction signs. So all of that is in violation of the First Amendment, since we are basing the sign allowances and size, height, all of that kind of stuff on what the sign is saying. So, in May, we brought forward the Reed versus Town of Gilbert updates to City Council, and they provided consensus for us to move forward on making those updates to the sign code. And they also provided some additional sign types that they wanted us to look into. They were concerned about temporary signs, or I guess maybe the current status of temporary signs in the city. Another council member wanted to look at iconic signage, which we've now kind of transitioned into 3D signs. So over the course of the summer, we took all that into consideration. We scrubbed the code. We did a lot of research into those other items that were asked of us and brought that back to City Council for their kind of approval moving forward, and also some further input on other issues that arose during our research. Then, as is typical for any code amendment to the Zoning and Development Code, we brought it to Planning Commission for further input in November. And then for final kind of checks and balances, we brought it back then to City Council for kind of a final nod of approval before we brought something forward to them at a public hearing. So, it's also important to note, I guess, in December, City Council also had a new mayor and new City Council member on board. Some of the issues that we brought to you in November were split decisions from the council, so we thought it was important to bring it back to them just to make sure the new members of council and the mayor were on board, and also to consider some of the additional input that you had provided. Where we ended up in December was council kind of reaffirming a lot of their original decisions and saying thank you, but no thank you to a lot of your suggestions, to put that nicely. I didn't know how to word that. That's the best that we can do. So we'll move forward, and I'll just quickly run through some of the issues that there was agreement on that we can kind of check off the list, and then talk to you about some of the issues that they disagreed with your position on. So first, of course, the Reed versus Gilbert content scrub was supported by both the commissioners and council. They also supported the one temporary sign allowance per commercial business. One thing that council did ask us to do is put a 1-year delay on enforcement of that new one one temporary sign per business, so that we can reach out to businesses and make sure that they're aware of the laws that are changing. I think they provided an example of maybe someone spent a couple $100, yesterday on a banner sign and flutter flags, and now they find out that they can't have both. So just kind of a gap period where we're informing people, and they can, kind of get into shape for, a year from when this is adopted. The other sign types that that there was agreement on was the signs carried by persons or the sign spinners. The illuminant standards for our electronic message centers, which all fall under our changeable copy sign category. This also included a reduction in the minimum time between messages. Currently it's 15 seconds. Everyone agreed that 8 was the appropriate number. Also puts us in line with all of our surrounding jurisdictions. Excuse me. Let's see. 3D signs, off-premise signs, business district signage, general agreement among the planning commissioners and council. If afterwards you want to ask me about those specifics, if you don't remember what we talked about, I'd be happy to answer those, but I'll just brush those off for right now. Since there was agreement, so areas where we did not agree, marked by the little X's, yard signs residential. So as you are aware, we permitted, as we no longer have political signs or any type of those signs, we had to create a new category that kind of grouped all of those together. So that was our yard signs category, specifically the small yard signs category. Council wished to have no limit on the number of residential signs that were allowed on a residential property. When we brought that to you all, you thought some limitations would be appropriate. Council did not agree when we brought that back to them, even for their consideration. They took a real personal property rights approach to that, and not wanting to tell folks how many signs that they could put on their property. So their kind of final direction was unlimited number of residential yard signs are allowed. For freestanding signs, the discussion was mainly focused around monument versus pole signs. City Council was originally split on the issue, with Mayor Jay breaking the tie in favor of not requiring monument signs citywide. Council did always support monument signs for new development or total redevelopment, but if Joe's Coffee Shop just wants to put up a new sign, they thought it was appropriate that they should be allowed to put up a pole sign. Planning Commission did wish to see all new signs in the city be monument signs. Council, again, solidified their original position and wanted to see, just in favor of business owners, recognizing that monument signs could be fairly expensive compared to a pole sign, allowing existing businesses who aren't redeveloping, who aren't doing any major work, to be able to put up a pole sign, but still requiring monument signs for redevelopment and new development. The next category was non-conforming signs. So council actually originally kind of pushed this off to Planning Commission. They wanted to create an amortization schedule, but they weren't really sure what that looked like, and kind of deferred that to you all. And you recommended a 3-year amortization for non-conforming signs, and then you also added potentially a 10-year amortization of existing pole signs. So obviously with the last discussion, the pole sign suggestion kind of went away. When we presented the 3-year timeline to them, they actually kind of backtracked on their own original stance on the non-conforming sign issue. We don't have any sort of indication as to how many non-conforming signs are in the city, and they really wanted that information before they moved forward on amortizing those. So as it stands now in the sign code draft that is in your packet, all of the non-conforming section remains the same as it is in the current code. And I think council is willing to relook at that at some point in time, that we're able to get them information on non-conforming signs. I don't know when that would be, but I think they are open to amortizing them. They just want more information first. Finally, changeable copy. I left that as a dot because generally we agreed, City Council and Planning Commission agreed in reaffirming the current prohibition against changeable copy LED signs in the mixed-use neighborhood zone district. So again, that's mostly along 38th Avenue between Sheridan and Wadsworth. There's a couple pockets throughout town, but that's where the majority of that zone district is. Both agreed on keeping the prohibition in place. Where the difference came in was the carve-out that we brought to you. The school district wants to put a sign on the school on 38th Avenue. When we brought that to Planning Commission, there was general consensus that there was no objections to creating a carve-out for them. City Council did, after thinking about it for a little bit, they kind of went back and forth. They weren't really comfortable with creating a carve-out for a government entity to not follow its own rules, essentially is what it came down to. So they had no problem with the school having a sign. They just wanted it to be established through a different method, so like through a variance, through the Board of Adjustment. They preferred taking things through that route instead of building it into the sign code update. So that's where we landed on changeable copy. Generally, agreement, just the carve out, there was a little bit different opinion, but we can still get the school where they need to be, assuming it gets brought forward to the Board of Adjustment and they approve it. So then just some next steps, and then I'll be able to answer any questions. I know we spent a long time on this last time we were here, so I'm going to just kind of breeze through this and then kind of let you ask any questions that you might have. Obviously, we're here at the Planning Commission public hearing, March 15th. Next step is the City Council public hearing, April 23rd. If it's approved, then it will go into effect 15 days after that public hearing. And then after adoption, we would have a lot of kind of background work to do. So we have a bunch of signed handouts that would need to be updated, a bunch of online documents that would need to be updated. The illuminate standards and the temporary sign regulations, we would need to work on an outreach program with the public information officer, potentially with some of the local business districts to kind of get that word out there that, hey, we do have illuminate standards now and we will be enforcing it. We do have temporary sign standards now and we will be enforcing it within the next year. So getting that word out and making sure everyone's kind of up to speed will be kind of our priority after adoption. And then we have some graphics that would need to be updated to reflect the new code, these new sign categories. So it would kind of be all behind the scenes work after adoption, but still next steps. So with that, if you have any questions, I might sit down and grab my tea, if that's okay. I can answer any questions that you have.
Okay, Commissioner Bowden.
Just one quick question. So if an existing business has a pole sign and that business changes ownerships, I guess hypothetically without doing any construction or redevelopment, would they be able to put up their new sign on that pole, or would they be required to? Okay.
No, yep, they would be allowed to put up their new sign on the existing pole.
Okay.
And technically, if they wanted to tear down that pole sign and build a new pole sign, they could, as long as they weren't redeveloping their property.
Okay.
Mr. Muckman?
Yeah, just with regards to the yard sign designation, I understand the need to remove content as a context for defining signage. But when we're talking about yard sign, I see here it's defined under the, I don't know where it is, under the definitions, as temporary ground-mounted portable sign constructed of paper, vinyl, plastic, wood, metal, or other comparable material, and designed or intended to be displayed for a limited period of time. I was trying to figure out, like, okay, say I have a really enthusiastic neighbor who really loves a particular candidate or cause or whatever, and they put 50 signs in their yard, as they have every right to. Say they leave them up for a year. I don't see a sort of designation for what a limited period of time is here in the code. I might be missing it, but I searched for it and I didn't see any of that. How do we make that determination? Of what a limited period of time means, and how is that enforceable?
Sure. So the limited period of time is mainly related to the construction of the sign, right? So of paper, plastic, wood material that typically doesn't last for a while. How do we enforce some sort of time regulation? We can't. I think we actually had them in the old sign code and we removed them because it's impossible to enforce. You would have to go by a property every single day and see that the signs were out to enforce some sort of time regulation, and that's just not something our code enforcement staff has the capacity to do.
Okay. Because the materials that are listed there, you could theoretically make a sign out of metal and keep it there forever.
It'd be really bad if you saw a neighbor pouring a foundation for a sign that is sized as our yard small sign, but that is clearly something that would be more permanently in place. So that's kind of, the limitation is that we have to sort of define things by time, place, and manner. And so if you have any suggestions of how to wordsmith that, we'd be open to it. But it's as Zach said, it's sort of about the construction method, that it could be removed versus it being constructed in some sort of a permanent method.
So as long as I make my yard sign sized statements for my yard sized art project removable, I can leave them there as long as I want.
Correct.
Okay, I'll remember that. No, I'm not trying to make light of it. I understand the issue. I understand the limitations of enforcement. It was the one thing I saw in here that seemed sort of vague, and I wanted to hopefully get some clarification on. All right.
Commissioner Dorsey? Commissioner Voss?
I thought a blade sign was that fabric, kind of semi-oval sign. What are you calling those?
Oh, those fall under our pennant category, I believe, right? Yes.
What are they?
Pennant category.
Oh.
So there's it's under the temporary signs, pennant, streamer, and other similar devices.
What section is that?
So there's the definition in the definition section, which states it to be a sign made of flexible material intended to create visual attraction through movement, inclusive of flutter flags. So I think that's
Is that what you're calling a flutter flag?
Exactly, yep.
I thought that's what a blade sign was. So then when you talked about blades over there, I was like,
There's a surprising number of synonyms for that sort of feather flag, flutter flag. But blade, as in doing our research, blade was more typically used in other jurisdictions in referring to the more permanent projecting from a wall sign. So
okay, thank you.
we do have images that were those included in the ordinance, that will help to illustrate some of what we mean. Because we've noticed that increasingly other jurisdictions are using some limited graphics, so it's not limiting in terms of what we can enforce, but it's illustrative of sort of what we mean by this language.
Any other questions? Commissioner Voss? Okay. Commissioner Leo? Commissioner Leo? Commissioner Weaver?
Okay.
Could you please?
Large frontage on 38th, and so under this, I could put up many temporary signs along 38th saying whatever I want.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Or my political beliefs, or my philosophy for the day, or...
There's a limitation on commercial speech on a residential property, so home occupations still have the limit of one sign, that's certain square footage, but all other sort of free speech, First Amendment.
So I can only put one for sale egg sign,
Correct.
but I can say whatever I want on all the other signs.
It's the way that it's written.
Okay, I just wanted to understand that that's the way it was written. Thanks. Start driving down 38th.
I have a couple questions on the So if this sign code passes, as far as the leasing signs go, all leasing signs would be prohibited unless they were in an approved master sign plan?
Not necessarily. They could fit under some of these other,
Be the yard sign large
yeah.
category, which we had to word in a funky way of.
What if it was like a 32 square foot wooden sign?
Something of that size or similar is allowed under the yard large.
Yeah, so yard large is our attorney reviewed this language, but you'll just see on sort of the second to last sheet of the ordinance, allowed only in properties with active listings for sale or for rent, or properties with active building permits. So this is our creative way of allowing leasing and under construction signs, where you're not actually reading the sign, you're just looking at what's happening on the property. And then you say, okay, based on what's happening on the property, it's either on the market or under construction, you can have a sign up to 32 square feet.
Right.
But
Okay.
we can't actually call a spade.
And are those, and was that permanent or not, or?
Those are listed under the temporary.
Temporary? Yeah. So do you have any, one of the questions that Commissioner Buckman was talking about as far as permanency, is there any definition of like what is permanent or not permanent? I mean, if it was a small yard sign, you could conceivably get it out of the ground pretty easy, so I could argue and say, well, that's not very permanent. You know, I could get it out with not very big equipment. So I guess what's the definition of permanent versus temporary?
I mean, it would be the sign type then. I mean, so you're like the difference between a yard large and a freestanding sign, perhaps?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Is it come into context of footings?
Right. So I think as Lauren mentioned with, if you see someone pouring a foundation, that's a permanent freestanding sign. If it's just stuck into the ground, right, like the real estate signs are on one end, that can be easily pulled out, right?
Well, there is also other means of attachments that I've seen with guying trees that are they're as permanent as long as you want them to be permanent.
Mm-hmm. So no, there's no time limitations on either of them, if that's what the question is.
Yeah, at some point, I think, and you heard Mr. Dahl probably talk about this at the study session, you can write the code. We have some definitions in the code. We always default to the Merriam-Webster dictionary for any term not defined, and then it just comes down to sort of, we're allowed to interpret them. If somebody's going to disagree with us on, permanent sign requires a building permit. So if somebody were to install something and we come out and say you needed a permanent, or you needed a building permit because we view this as a permanent sign, they can certainly challenge that interpretation. We've not had that issue in my time here, so it's a lot of sort of semantics in here. We do have the definition of temporary. We don't have a definition of permanent because sort of each of those types of permanent signs are relatively unique and have their own definitions.
Have you had any type of, study session or conference with code enforcement over some of these items to kind of get a consensus?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So code enforcement was sent the Illuminance language along with, I believe,
a lot of the temporary language that they've struggled to enforce
right.
because our code's too vague right now.
Yep.
So as Zach was mentioning, we have sort of our next stage. We've been working on the sign code for over a year, which feels grilling and ready to be done with, but we still probably have another year of work in terms of continued education with code enforcement, with businesses, with the community, with our handouts, rolling things out to the website. So we meet with code enforcement every month. We sort of do topical discussions, property discussions in the first half, and we do 30 minutes of training, and that topic changes every month. So certainly signage will be, once this is an official adopted ordinance, that would be next on the HIP parade.
Yeah, and we actually have it scheduled for the May meeting.
May.
Yep. Perfect. So presumably, this would get approved on April 23rd, at council, and then we would be able to talk about kind of everything. Obviously, they have access to it now, but talking through some of these issues, just kind of like we are now, with them on May, whatever that first Wednesday is in May. So it's on their radar, and it's on our radar to make sure that they know all of the details.
Are there any other questions for staff? Okay, let's open up the citizens forum. I don't see anybody in the audience. I will now close the citizens forum since there's nobody signed up to speak. I would entertain a motion.
I make a motion, well, I don't really see a motion page.
It's on the back.
There it is.
I think it got cut to another page.
I move to recommend approval of the proposed ordinance amending Articles 7 of Chapter 26 of the Code of Laws concerning the sign code.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? I have one thing I just want to say is I am totally okay with the suggestion about the LED changing the variance for the school. I think that sounds fine to me. I don't know what the other commissioners feel about that as opposed to carving out a separate. I think it's a good idea. Any other comments?
Well, you know, I think it could kind of go either way. You know, we make an exception for government and county organizations to kind of build whatever they want on any zoning without having to get it rezoned, which is understandable, you know, because it's in the public good. But signs tend to impact the immediate public, you know, who are passing by it more directly. So it goes from, it's a balance of public good versus maybe public distraction or nuisance, especially with an electric sign. So I think we could make it a case to include it in this code, but I think a variance will do the same thing. It'll receive the same level of scrutiny there.
Any other comments? Call for vote.
Motion carried 7-0.
Is there any old business?
No old business.
Any new business?
A couple just quick new business items. First up, Ms. Kibsey did resign her seat on the commission, so we have a vacancy in District 4, so you all know and anybody watching knows. That's been posted recently on the Board and Commission openings page on the city's website. City Council did review but defer appointments for all boards and commissions, so they'll be discussing and appointing those at the next meeting on March 26th. So you typically have an appointment by now whereby usually in March we'd be electing a chair and vice chair, so we'll just defer that election of chairs until April. And that said, there are 5 Thursdays in March, so we won't see you for a couple weeks, but we do have a few items for the April 5th meeting date.
Okay.
Lauren?
Yes.
When did Donna resign? Does that come into?
Just recently, in the
just
last
recently?
week or so.
Oh, okay. So that's not part of the
It's not part of the
March
March 26th. Nope. Because it's just now on the website in the last couple days. Yeah.
Anything else? Is there a motion to adjourn?
I move to adjourn.
Second? Second. Call for vote.
Motion carried 7-0.
Thank you.